Welcome back to another lecture overview for Psych 4421. Today we're going to be jumping into substance abuse. We're going to look at substance use and addiction through a lifespan perspective. Instead of thinking about addiction as something that just appears and happens within adolescence and adulthood, we're actually going to explore the risks and how it develops among the stages before birth all the way through adulthood. So by the end of today, you'll be able to understand how biological, psychological, and social factors all interact over time and influence substance use and addiction. So as we jump in today, I want to first start off by talking about early development. It may surprise us at times because we don't often think about substance use and abuse before we're even born, but oftentimes we're starting before someone is even born. And a lot of times those influences can impact us into our adolescence and adulthood. So researchers in 1996 found that prenatal exposure to substances, especially alcohol, can have actually long-term effects on a child's development. So these effects actually include difficulties with attention, memory, behavioral regulation, cognitive development, and things that make up a child at their whole. So what's actually important here is that these early developmental challenges can actually increase our vulnerability later in life. Therefore, it can make it harder for individuals to regulate their behavior or cope with trauma or stress, which are important in understanding substance use and risk. So if we are already predisposed to this, there's a likely chance that we are to become alcoholics or substance users later in our lifetime. So now we're moving into how substance use typically begins. A study conducted in 1975 showed that substance use tends to follow developmental sequences rather than happening just randomly out of the blue. People often start with more socially accepted substances, such as like alcohol or nicotine, and then some progress into marijuana and then other drugs. What I see with the students that I use or I work with is that they are typically trickling in from the more marijuana nicotine, and then it trickles into additional drugs if so. However, a majority of my students I do work with have an addiction to either nicotine or marijuana. So it's progressing in their adolescence. So this progression is highly influenced by social factors, especially peer groups and availability of the substance. A lot of times the substance is kind of free flowing throughout the high school or in middle school. And a lot of times if you aren't doing those things, then you are not the cool person. So our social influences and peer influences also highly shape whether someone is likely or not likely to engage in substances. So what's important is that not everyone follows this exact path, but substance use is typically patterned and predictable between the population. So a lot of times we see at the early stages that it's highly socially developed. So now let's look at substance use across the entire lifespan. So researchers in 1998 show that substance use disorders begin in adolescence or even early adulthood. So we're talking as young as 15 years old all the way up to about 25 years old. But they don't all follow the same path that we may typically think. Some individuals experiment with the drugs and alcohol and substances and then cease that usage, while others develop more persistent patterns because they become more dependent on that. We also see that different substances have different timelines. So an example is alcohol use may peak at certain ages than other drugs. So for instance, college age, we see substance use typically jump and spike during that, and then a lot of times it starts to dissipate within later adulthood or later 20s per se. So the key idea here is that actually timing matters. So when substance use begins can strongly influence whether or not becomes long-term users of that substance. Another major factor in development is actually family environment. So researchers in 1991 show that children of individuals with substance use disorders are at higher risk than themselves. So what that means is if we have a parent that is a substance user, we as their children may be more susceptible to having a substance use disorder later in the line. So this happens throughout various different ranges, a lot of times an accumulation of all of these things. But the first is genetics, whether we're predisposed of the addictive gene and whether or not that may play out. Also, learned or modeled behaviors. If we watch our parent when they get frustrated and angry or have a challenging day at work, pour a glass of wine every day, and then it leads to two or three, or crack open a couple of beers, we as kids are taking in all that information like sponges and are utilizing that as if that's how mom and dad cope or our caregivers cope, then that may be a way that I can cope with stressful situations. Also, environmental stress. What's happening in the environment surrounding where you live, the neighborhood, that also highly influences the behaviors as well. So, it's really important for us to emphasize that risk is not all deterministic. So, it is probabilistic. So, not everyone with a family history develops addiction. Instead, it increases our vulnerability, especially when we have other risk factors as well. So overall, family influence does matter, but they interact with the other factors along with it. What's happening in the brain when it comes to substance use and addiction is actually very important for us to really understand, because it shows that addiction involves in changing and rewiring the brain's system. So not only does it rewire the brain system and how it perceives kind of rewards and the dopamine hits, we are also, especially if we're using substances significantly before the age of 25, our brain is not fully developed until then. So therefore, we are at increased vulnerability to being able to damage that prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain up here, which doesn't develop until that time. So when we think about how it affects the brain, it actually includes the reward system, which is tied to our dopamine hit. Dopamine makes us feel good, and also the prefrontal cortex, which helps us with decision making and self-control. That's why we see teenagers often don't stop and think before they make these decisions when it comes to substances, because their prefrontal cortex is still developing. So with that being said, with repeated use of substances, these systems, our reward, our prefrontal cortex, can become altered in ways that make behavior more compulsive and much more harder to regulate and stop. So I'll give an example. I worked with a student who utilized THC vape pens since the age of 13. And from the age now we're taking them, I worked with them at 16, they struggle to not utilize that substance when stress is present, because for the last 3 years stress was present and they relied on the THC pens. So with that being said, they have learned to rewire their brain in the short 3 years, yet long 3 years of their life, and it's led to them having a harder time regulating. So this kind of helps explain that addiction isn't simply about just like willpower. It actually reflects that measurable changes in the brain function actually do occur with increased use. And we aren't just trying not to use, it's actually our brain is rewiring itself to want to use even more. So as we close out our time today, let's look at the big picture and how this integrates all together. So to wrap everything up, addiction is understood as a developmental process. It happens throughout time. It can be associated with early biological risks, continue through social and environmental influences, and often can become reinforced through the brain and how it changes throughout time. So importantly, there isn't just one pathway in which to have a substance use disorder. It's typically projected throughout with various factors: environmental, stress, modeled behaviors, the genetics. So this tells us that prevention and intervention is actually very important. I, as a school-based mental health provider, implement curriculum throughout the entire school year about substance use and the impacts it can have on brain development and the students that I work with. So overall, it's a combination of biological, environmental, and developmental aspects over time, and it does greatly impact us as we develop through the lifespan. So thank you for being on this journey with me, and I can't wait till next week.